Officer, I got one question for you. What are those? What?
Just downtown. Any questions?
I got one question for you. What are those?
Do you like my new boots?
I got one question for you. What are those?
Hi, Sarah.
I got one question for you. What are those?
Ring, 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 ring.
What are those? What are the?
George, do you like my new shoes?
What are those?
Yo, Mike, you looking fresh as shit right now.
Thanks, Barney.
But I got one question for you. What are those?
So kids can call them whenever they have questions.
I've got a question.
What are those?
He was just a kid with a lot of questions.
I got one question for you. What are those?
True friends. One question.
What are those?
It's set to M for mini, when it should be set to W for
What are those? I got one question for you. What are those?
You shouldn't have. Yeah, you shouldn't have. I mean, Dad, you really shouldn't have.
What are those?
Do you mind if I ask you a few questions for my report?
Sure. What would you like to know?
What are those?
Mom, you look cute today, but what are those?
Steph.
That's not funny.
Shoe game on point.
I got one question for you. What are those? What are those?
Hey man, I was looking for these everywhere. Ooh, man.
What are those? Officer, I got one question for you. What are those? What are those? One question for you. What are those? What are those? I got one question for you. What are those?
Hey conejo, tengo una pregunta para usted. ¿Qué son esos? Good evening.
What are those? What are those?
I'll ask 21 questions.
What are those? What are
outside with no shirt? Me and my broski down to earth. We both got endless bodies and
what are those?
Are you competing for cutest kid right now?
Yes.
I got one question for you. What are those?
well, that's why your shoe game weak.
What are those?
This guy's so rich, he has a swimming pool in his swimming pool.
What are those?
Just assuming you keep the coke moving, but I got one question.
What are those?
Chad, I got a question for you. They're vans. They're vans.
You're looking tall.
I got one question for you. What are those? What are those? What are those?
Came to see me in my black skin. Number one question they asking.
What are those? I got one question for you. What are those?
Excuse me, sir.
I got one question for you. What are those?
Hey, SpongeBob, want to see my new shoes?
What are those?
Bro, what the fuck are those? Oh, bro.
I just got one question for you.
What are those?
I got one question for you. What are those? What are those?
Steve.
Yes?
I have one question for you.
What?
What are those?
10:30. I'm like,
what are those? I got one question for you. What are those?
Compilation. I got one question for this man.
What are those?
Can I have a question for you?
What are those? I got one question for you. What are those?
Hey, SpongeBob.
I got one question for you. What are those? What are those?
Let's just be honest. Let's just be real.
What are those? What?
Holla at him.
I got one question for you. What are those?
Boy, what the fuck are those?
Confusing me with questions like,
what are those? What are those?